Extracts. pp. 17 to 29. Broadly speaking, prejudicial dysfunction in testimonial practice, stereotypes in hearers' judgments of speakers' credibility. pp. 86 to 90. We have so far developed a picture. Tom is telling the truth. pp. 98 to 108. The picture of the virtue of testimonial injustice that is present in any human society.
Spontaneous assessments of their interlocutor's credibility. This use of stereotypes may be entirely proper, or it may be misleading, depending on the stereotype. Notably, if the stereotype embodies a prejudice that works against the speaker, then two things follow. There is an epistemic dysfunction in the exchange. The hearer makes an unduly deflated judgment of the speaker's credibility, perhaps missing out on knowledge as a result, and the hearer does something ethically bad. The speaker is wrongfully undermined in her capacity as a knower. I now turn to the exploration of this dual epistemic and ethical dysfunction. The task is to home in on what is perhaps the most ethically and socially significant moment of identity power's impact on our discursive and epistemic relations, and to paint a portrait of the distinctive injustice that it entails, testimonial injustice. 1.3 The central case of testimonial injustice. Broadly speaking, prejudicial dysfunction in testimonial practice can be of two kinds. Either the prejudice results in the speaker's receiving more credibility than she otherwise would have, a credibility excess, or it results in her receiving less credibility than she otherwise would have, a credibility deficit. Consider the immediate discursive impact of a speaker's accent, for instance. Not only does accent carry a social charge that affects how a hearer perceives a speaker, it may indicate a certain educational class regional background, but very often it also carries an epistemic charge. Accent can have a significant impact on how much credibility a hearer affords a speaker, especially in a one-off exchange. I do not mean that someone's accent is especially likely to lead a hearer, even an intensely prejudiced one, automatically to reject outright some manifestly believable assertion or, conversely, to firmly believe some otherwise incredible assertion. No doubt these things are possible, but given that for the most part it is generally in the interests of hearers to believe what is true and not believe what is false, it would be a strong prejudice in an unusual context that would be single-handedly powerful enough to have that sort of effect. The idea is rather that prejudice will tend surreptitiously to inflate or deflate the credibility afforded the speaker, and sometimes this will be sufficient to cross the threshold for belief or acceptance, so that the hearer's prejudice causes him to miss out on a piece of knowledge. In face-to-face testimonial exchanges, the hearer must make some attribution of credibility regarding the speaker. Such attributions are surely governed by no precise science, but clearly there can be error in the direction of excess or deficit. On the whole, excess will tend to be advantageous, and deficit disadvantageous. As a qualification, however, we should note that in localized contexts, excess could bring disadvantage in its wake, and deficit could conceivably bring advantage. With regard to the former, consider an overburdened GP whose patients ask him medical questions that call for a more specialist training. He is not in a position to answer them fully responsibly, yet he must do his best to answer them since the patients need an answer and he is the only source they have access to. His patients assume that he is in a position to provide the information they need, and thus they attribute to him an excess of credibility on the matters in question. Let us add that any attempts to disabuse them of their inflated view of his expertise would damage the doctor-patient relationship by unduly undermining their confidence in him. All this is an ethical burden for our GP, because he is aware that his best advice might yet mislead them about an important health issue. For this GP, the credibility excess he receives from his patients brings an unwanted ethical burden, and so we see that credibility excess can be disadvantageous. 13. Alternatively, consider the example of a professor who gives a more junior colleague some work for comments, and who is relying on that colleague's critical feedback to get the thing straight before a conference presentation. If the junior colleague is an admirer and gives too much benefit of the doubt, then his comments will be less critical than they might otherwise be, and the professor is effectively let down. Again, the credibility excess she receives on this occasion is only a disadvantage to her. In such circumstances as these, then, credibility excess can be disadvantageous, though on the whole it is surely more usually an advantage. What of the possibility that credibility deficit can in unusual circumstances be an advantage? Consider the stuttering Claudius, destined one day to be emperor of Rome, but who repeatedly escapes political murder on the way up owing to the fact that he is generally taken to be a fool. Or alternatively, recall that inimitable character from 70s TV crime detection, Lieutenant Columbo, whose bumbling and shambolic style lures those he is investigating into a false sense of security and enables him to quiz them off guard. Credibility deficit, then, in such specific and localized contexts can be advantageous. In general, however, we shall see that credibility is a good that one needs to get enough of for all manner of well-functioning, and accordingly we should think of its deficit as generally disadvantageous. On the face of it, one might think that both credibility deficit and credibility excess are cases of testimonial injustice. Certainly there is a sense of injustice that might naturally and quite properly be applied to cases of credibility excess, as when one might complain at the injustice of someone receiving unduly high credibility in what he said just because he spoke with a certain accent. At a stretch, this could be cast as a case of injustice as distributive unfairness. Someone has got more than his fair share of a good, but that would be straining the idiom, for credibility is not a good that belongs with the distributive model of justice. Unlike those goods that are fruitfully dealt with along distributive lines, such as wealth or health care, there is no puzzle about the fair distribution of credibility, for credibility is a concept that wears its proper distribution on its sleeve. Epistemological nuance aside, the hearer's obligation is obvious. She must match the level of credibility she attributes to her interlocutor to the evidence that he is offering the truth. Further, those goods best suited to the distributive model are so suited principally because they are finite and at least potentially in short supply. Recall Hume on the genealogy of justice. A situation of plenty is not testimonial injustice, which the distributive concept will naturally arise. Such goods are those for which there is or may soon be a certain competition, and that is what gives rise to the ethical puzzle about the justice of this or that particular distribution. By contrast, credibility is not generally finite in this way, and so there is no analogous competitive demand to invite the distributive treatment. Accordingly, in cases of credibility deficit, the injustice we are aiming to track down is not to be characterized as non-receipt of one's fair share of a good credibility, as this would fail to capture the distinctive respect in which the speaker is wronged. The idea is to explore testimonial injustice as a distinctively epistemic injustice, as a kind of injustice in which someone is wronged specifically in her capacity as a knower. Clearly, credibility deficit can constitute such a wrong, but while credibility excess may unusually be disadvantageous in various ways, it does not undermine insult or otherwise withhold a proper respect for the speaker qua subject of knowledge, so in itself it does her no epistemic injustice, and a fortiori no testimonial injustice. On the contrary, our imagined professor and GP are overly esteemed in their capacity as knowers. Yet could it be we should press the question that there are some circumstances in which being overly esteemed in one's capacity as a knower would do one harm of a sort that merits the label testimonial injustice? Suppose we imagine someone growing up who, because of various social prejudices overwhelmingly in his favor, is constantly epistemically puffed up by the people around him. Let's say that he is a member of a ruling elite, and that his education and entire upbringing are subtly geared to installing this message firmly in his psychology. Perhaps the pupils who attend his school even wind up with a distinctive accent and certainly a confident air that helps mark them out as epistemically authoritative. No doubt the credibility excess he tends to receive from most interlocutors in his class-ridden society will be advantageous. It is very likely to bring him lucrative employment, and a certain automatic high status in many of his discursive exchanges, and so on. But what if all this also causes him to develop such an epistemic arrogance that a range of epistemic virtues are put out of his reach, rendering him closed-minded, dogmatic, blithely impervious to criticism, and so on? Is it not the case that such a person has in some degree quite literally been made a fool of? And if so, is there not something to the idea that the catalogue of credibility excesses that have malformed his epistemic character amounts to some sort of testimonial injustice? Is he not, after all, precisely wronged in his capacity as a knower? I think the answer is probably yes, and we are perhaps confronted with an interesting special case of testimonial injustice. Note, however, that it is cumulative, whereas our focus has been on token cases of the injustice. I do not think it would be right to characterize any of the individual moments of credibility excess that such a person receives as in itself an instance of testimonial injustice, since none of them wrongs him sufficiently in itself. It is only if enough of them come together in the semi-fanciful manner described that each moment of credibility excess takes on the aspect of something that contributes to the subject's being epistemically wronged over the long term. Consequently, I would suggest that while the example does indicate that some people in a consistently privileged position of social power might be subject to a variant strain of testimonial injustice, namely, testimonial injustice in its strictly cumulative form, nonetheless it does not show that any token cases of credibility excess constitute a testimonial injustice. The primary characterization of testimonial injustice, then, remains such that it is a matter of credibility deficit and not credibility excess. Let us begin to home in on the concept of testimonial injustice, now duly conceived as a form of credibility deficit. First point to notice is that prejudice is not the only thing that can cause credibility deficit, and so not all sorts of credibility deficit are cases of testimonial injustice. A credibility deficit might simply result from innocent error that is both ethically and epistemically non-culpable. One reason why there will always be cases of innocent error is that human judgment is fallible, and so it is inevitable that even the most skilled and perceptive hearers will on occasion come up with a mistaken judgment of a speaker's credibility. More specifically, a hearer may simply have a false belief about the speaker's level of expertise and/or motives, so that she gives him less credibility than she might otherwise have done. So long as her false belief is itself ethically and epistemically non-culpable, it does not, for example, result from an immoral hatefulness or from epistemic carelessness, there will be nothing culpable in her misjudgment of his credibility. It is simply an unlucky epistemic mistake of one or another familiar kind. Consider an example in which the hearer, let us say that she is a philosopher, an ethicist, knows that her interlocutor is an academic at a certain institution, and having looked him up on the web, she believes him to be a medic, since his name was listed under medical sciences. When the conversation turns to a certain current debate in the literature pertaining to her own specialism, moral fictionalism, and to her surprise he expresses a forthright critical view on the fictionalist approach, she affords his word a lower credibility than she would if she took him for a fellow ethicist. In fact, however, unbeknownst to her, he is an ethicist, with a specialism in medical ethics employed in a medical department, and so her false belief about his professional identity has put him in credibility deficit for the duration. Yet I would suggest that her misjudgment does him no real testimonial injustice. It is simply an innocent error. An unlucky mistake of this sort, then, can cause a credibility deficit that does not constitute a case of testimonial injustice. At least I suggest that we circumscribe the concept in this manner. Of course, it would not be linguistically outrageous for our imagined hearer, embarrassed on learning the true professional identity of her interlocutor, to say she felt bad for doing him such an injustice. But this would be a very weak sense of injustice, so much so that it is a mere shadow of our ordinary ethical and political sense of the word, and lacks the usual implication of moral badness. This is largely a terminological point, so if others disagree, then they can regard cases of innocent error as producing a weak form of testimonial injustice. For my part, however, I shall reserve the term for cases in which there is something ethically bad about the hearer's misjudgment. What about credibility deficit caused by ethically innocent but epistemically culpable error? If we revisit our example and alter it so that we picture our philosopher making her mistake as the result of a hopelessly careless web search, I suggest that we find that the credibility deficit she assigns her interlocutor still does not amount to a testimonial injustice. Her unduly deflated credibility judgment of him does not insult or undermine him as a knower, for she has simply made a stupid mistake. While her error is epistemically culpable, its ethical non-culpability still seems to prevent the resultant credibility deficit from constituting a testimonial injustice. An ethically non-culpable mistake cannot undermine or otherwise wrong the speaker. It seems that the ethical poison of testimonial injustice must derive from some ethical poison in the judgment of the hearer, and there is none such wherever the hearer's error is ethically non-culpable. The proposal I am heading for is that the ethical poison in question is that of prejudice. From different points in history, one might draw on many depressing examples of prejudices obviously relevant to the context of credibility judgment, such as the idea that women are irrational, blacks are intellectually inferior to whites, the working classes are the moral inferior of the upper classes, Jews are wily, Orientals are sly, and so on in a grim catalogue of clichés more or less likely to insinuate themselves into judgments of credibility at different moments in history. But in order to furnish the philosophical imagination less crudely, let us turn to an example from literature that provides us with a historically truthful fiction. The example is from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The year is 1935 and the scene a courtroom in Macomb County, Alabama. The defendant is a young black man named Tom Robinson. He is charged with raping a white girl, Mayella Ewell, whose family's rundown house he passes every day on his way to work, situated as it is on the outskirts of town in the borderlands that divide where whites and blacks live. It is obvious to the reader, and to any relatively unprejudiced person in the courtroom, that Tom Robinson is entirely innocent. For Atticus Finch, our politely spoken counsel for the defense, has proved beyond doubt that Robinson could not have beaten the Ewell girl so as to cause the sort of cuts and bruises she sustained that day, since whoever gave her the beating led with his left fist, whereas Tom Robinson's left arm is disabled, having been injured in a machinery accident when he was a boy. The trial proceedings enact what is in one sense a straightforward struggle between the power of evidence and the power of racial prejudice, with the all-white jury's judgment ultimately succumbing to the latter. But the psychology is subtle, and there is a great complexity of social meanings at work in determining the jury's perception of Tom Robinson as a speaker. In a showdown between the word of a black man and that of a poor white girl, the courtroom air is thick with Thedot's andants of racial politics. Telling the truth here is a minefield for Tom Robinson, since if he casts aspersions on the white girl, he will be perceived as a presumptuous, lying Negro. Yet if he does not publicize Mayella Ewell's attempt to kiss him, which is what really happened, then a guilty verdict is even more nearly assured. This discursive predicament mirrors his practical predicament at the Ewell's house on that fateful day when Mayella grabbed him. If he pushes her away, then he will be found to have assaulted her. Yet if he is passive, he will equally be found to have assaulted her. So he does the most neutral thing he can, which is to run, though knowing all the while that this action too will be taken as a sign of guilt. Mr. Gilmer's Testimonial Injustice. Interrogation of Tom is suffused with the idea that his running away implies culpability. Why did you run so fast? I says I was scared so. If you had a clear conscience, why were you scared? 16 Running away, it seems, is something a black man in Macomb County cannot do without incriminating himself. Similarly, there are many things he cannot say in court and stand a chance of being heard as truthful. At a pivotal moment during the prosecution's interrogation, for instance, Tom Robinson makes the mistake of being honest about his kindly motivations for stopping off at Mayella Ewell's house as regularly as he did to help her out with odd jobs. The scene, like the whole story, is reported from the point of view of Scout Atticus Finch's young daughter, who is secretly surveying the proceedings with her brother Jem from the Negro Gallery. Mr. Gilmer, the prosecutor, sets him up. Why were you so anxious to do that woman's chores?
Tom Robinson hesitated, searching for an answer. Looked like she didn't have nobody to help her, like I says. Mr. Gilmer smiled grimly at the jury. You're a mighty good fellow, it seems, did all this for not one penny. Yes, sir, I felt right sorry for her. She seemed to try more'n the rest of 'em. You felt sorry for her, you felt sorry for her. Mr. Gilmer seemed ready to rise to the ceiling. The witness realized his mistake and shifted uncomfortably in the chair, but the damage was done. Below us, nobody liked Tom Robinson's answer. Mr. Gilmer paused a long time to let it sink in. 17.
Here the damage in question is done to any epistemic trust that the white jury has so far been human enough to feel towards the black testifier. For feeling sorry for someone is a taboo sentiment if you are black and the object of your sympathy is a white person. In the context of a racist ideology structured around dogmas of white superiority, the fundamental ethical sentiment of plain human sympathy becomes disfigured in the eyes of whites, so that it appears as little more than an indicator of self-perceived advantage on the part of the black subject. A black man is not allowed to have feelings that imply a position of any sort of advantage relative to any white person, no matter how difficult and lonely her life might be. The fact that Tom Robinson makes the sentiment public raises the stakes in a way that is disastrous for legal justice and for the epistemic justice on which it depends. The trial is a zero-sum contest between the word of a black man against that of a white girl, or perhaps that of her father who has brought the case to court. And there are those on the jury for whom the idea that the black man is to be epistemically trusted, and the white girl distrusted is virtually a psychological impossibility. Robinson's expressed sympathy in feeling sorry for a white girl only reinforces that impossibility. As it turns out, the members of the jury stick with their prejudiced perception of the defendant, formed principally by the racial stereotypes of the day. Atticus Finch challenges them to dispense with these prejudicial stereotypes, to dispense, as he puts it, with the assumption, the evil assumption that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women. But when it comes to the verdict, the jurors go along with the automatic distrust delivered by the prejudices that structure their perception of the speaker. They find him guilty, and it is important that we are to interpret the novel so that the jurors really do find him guilty. That is to say, they do not privately find him innocent yet cynically convict him anyway. Even allowing that the psychology here may be to some degree indeterminate, it is crucial that they genuinely fail to do what Atticus Finch in his summing up describes as their duty.
In the name of God, do your duty. Atticus's voice had dropped, and as he turned away from the jury, he said something I did not catch. He said it more to himself than to the court. I punched Jem. What he say? In the name of God, believe him. I think that's what he said. 19.
Finch is trying to impress upon the jury that they have a duty to believe Tom Robinson, and this supports my interpretation of the juror's psychology. Finch evidently takes it that what the jury need to be urged to do is to make the right judgment, to do the right epistemic thing. He does not urge them to focus on their moral and legal duty to convict only if they truly judge the defendant guilty, for he is aware that their prejudice goes psychologically deeper than that, all the way to the jurors' very powers of judgment. When they do deliver the guilty verdict, this attests to their failure in their duty to make the proper testimonial judgment in the light of the evidence. They fail, as Atticus Finch feared, precisely in their duty to believe Tom Robinson. Given the evidence put before them, their immovably prejudiced social perception of Robinson as a speaker leads at once to a gross epistemic failure and an appalling ethical failure of grave practical consequence. As it turns out, Tom Robinson does not survive long enough to go ahead with any appeal, for he is shot in the back as he tries, we hear it said, to escape over the prison fence right in front of the guards. It is perhaps worth remarking that even the most hateful prejudicial ideologies may be sustained not only by explicitly hateful thought and talk, but also by more domestic stereotypical ideas that are almost cozy in comparison. There's a relatively lighthearted theme of epistemic untrustworthiness that runs through the book as a leitmotif, softly echoing the deadly serious racist exclusion from epistemic trust of the sort that leads ultimately to the killing of Tom Robinson. We see this, for instance, when Scout is talking to her family's friend and neighbor, Miss Maudie, about the reclusive and mysterious young Boo Radley aka Mr. Arthur, about whom spooky stories abound and who is an object of unfailing fascination for the children. Scout quizzes Miss Maudie about him.
Do you think they're true, all those things they say about Mr. Arthur? What things? I told her. That is 3/4 colored folks and 1/4 Stephanie Crawford, said Miss Maudie grimly.
Given a culture where it is so utterly natural for white people to associate colored folks in general with irresponsible gossip, even in a spirit of independent-mindedness, as is the case with Miss Maudie's response to Scout, it is not hard to imagine a relation of support between this comparatively cozy side of the ideology and the far harsher, more squarely unjust associations that work to undermine the epistemic trustworthiness of black people. While there may be nothing hateful in the more light-hearted side of these attitudes, still it may be a significant nutrient to the hateful ideology overall. Tom Robinson's case represents an extreme example of the sort of testimonial injustice I am aiming to portray philosophically. An initial sketch might lead us to capture it as prejudicial credibility deficit, but while this may serve as a general definition of testimonial injustice, it misses a crucial feature of the sort of testimonial injustice that Tom suffers. There are all sorts of prejudices that can cause credibility deficit, yet where the resultant testimonial injustice is highly localized, and therefore lacking any of the structural social significance that a case such as Tom Robinson's clearly has. Imagine, for instance, I adapt an example proposed to me by a scientist, a panel of referees on a science journal who have a dogmatic prejudice against a certain research method. It might reasonably be complained by a would-be contributor that authors who present hypotheses on the basis of the disfavored method receive a prejudicially reduced level of credibility from the panel. Thus, the prejudice is such as to generate a genuine testimonial injustice, writing being one medium of testimony. Although such a testimonial injustice may be grievous for the careers of the would-be contributors, and perhaps even for the progress of science, nonetheless its impact on the subject's life is, let us assume, highly localized. That is to say, the prejudice in question against a certain scientific method does not render the subject vulnerable to any other kinds of injustice, legal, economic, political. Let us say that the testimonial injustice produced here is incidental. By contrast, testimonial injustices that are connected, via common prejudice, with other types of injustice might appropriately be termed systematic. Systematic testimonial injustices, then, are produced not by prejudice simpliciter, but specifically by those prejudices that track the subject through different dimensions of social activity: economic, educational, professional, sexual, legal, political, religious, and so on. Being subject to a tracker prejudice renders one susceptible not only to testimonial injustice, but to a gamut of different injustices, and so when such a prejudice generates a testimonial injustice, that injustice is systematically connected with other kinds of actual or potential injustice. Clearly, the testimonial injustice suffered by Tom Robinson is systematic, for racial prejudice renders him susceptible to a panoply of injustices besides the testimonial kind. Systematic testimonial injustice constitutes our central case. It is central from the point of view of a guiding interest in how epistemic injustice fits into the broader pattern of social justice. The main type, the only type, of prejudice that tracks people in this way is prejudice relating to social identity. Let us call this sort of prejudice identity prejudice. It can come in positive or negative form, prejudice for or against people owing to some feature of their social identity. But since our interest is in cases of credibility deficit rather than excess, we shall be concerned only with negative identity prejudice. Indeed, I shall tend to use identity prejudice, as short for negative identity prejudice. The influence of identity prejudice in a hearer's credibility judgment is an operation of identity power. For in such a case, the influence of identity prejudice is a matter of one party or parties effectively controlling what another party does, preventing them, for instance, from conveying knowledge, in a way that depends upon collective conceptions of the social identities in play. In our Mockingbird example, racial identity power is exercised in this way by members of the jury as they make their deflated credibility judgments of Tom Robinson, with the result that he is unable to convey to them the knowledge he has of what happened at the UL's place. This is the essential exercise of identity power in the courtroom that seals Tom's fate, though of course it is not the whole story. For this operation of identity power is crucially supported by Mr. Gilmer's simple but highly effective prosecution strategy, which is to invoke the usual collective negative imaginings of the Negro. Gilmer deliberately controls the jurors, and sure enough the jurors go on to control what Tom Robinson does, preventing him from conveying his knowledge to them. With the concepts of identity prejudice and systematicity in place, we are now in a position to propose a refined characterization of the central case of testimonial injustice, the systematic case. The speaker sustains such a testimonial injustice if and only if she receives a credibility deficit owing to identity prejudice in the hearer. So the central case of testimonial injustice is identity prejudicial credibility deficit. We should note, however, that there could be exceptions. That is, one can imagine cases of identity prejudicial credibility deficit that are not cases of systematic testimonial injustice, and so not examples of our central case. Consider the following case, an anecdote recounted to me by a philosopher of science. There is a large international conference dominated by research scientists and some historians of science, with only a smattering of philosophers of science. It becomes clear that the philosophers of science are regarded by the majority of the other delegates as out of touch with the realities of scientific practice, so much so that they are, frankly, held in some intellectual disdain. In this context, it would seem, simply falling into the identity category philosopher of science renders one's word likely to be dismissed as the vain speculations of an out-of-touch academic. Thus, there are genuine cases of identity prejudicial credibility deficit going on here. These testimonial injustices, however, do not instantiate our central case, for they are not systematic. Despite the prejudices being an identity prejudice, it does not concern the kind of broad identity category that makes for a tracker prejudice. On the contrary, its social significance is highly localized to the specific conference context described. It therefore produces only an incidental testimonial injustice. To categorize a testimonial injustice as incidental is not to belittle it ethically. Localized prejudices and the injustices they produce may be utterly disastrous for the subject, especially if they are repeated frequently so that the injustice is persistent. If, for instance, the practical context in which the injustices occur is that of a project, professional or otherwise, which is crucial to the person's life being worth living, then the accumulation of incidental injustices may ruin their life. The importance of systematicity is simply that if a testimonial injustice is not systematic, then it is not central from the point of view of an interest in the broad pattern of social justice. Persistent labels the diachronic dimension of testimonial injustice's severity and significance, whereas systematic labels the synchronous dimension. The most severe forms of testimonial injustice are both persistent and systematic. Such is the case for Tom Robinson, who lives in a society in which the prejudice that devalues his word also blocks his everyday pursuits repeatedly and in every social direction. By contrast, cases of testimonial injustice that are neither persistent nor systematic are on the whole unlikely to be very disadvantageous. Generally speaking, systematic injustice tends towards persistence, because the imaginative conceptions of social identity that feature in the relevant tracker prejudices are likely to be enduring features of the social imagination. Now that I have identified our central case as systematic testimonial injustice, let us now inquire further into how identity prejudice enters in to make its impact on the discursive exchange. We must explore the role of stereotypes in hearers' judgments of speakers' credibility. 4. The virtue of testimonial justice. 4.1 Correcting for prejudice. We have so far developed a picture on which the hearer perceives the speaker in an epistemically loaded way. She sees him as more, or less, credible in what he is telling her. This perceptual faculty is trained in real historical human society, and this means that the presence of identity prejudice in the collective social imagination is an endemic hazard in the ongoing training of testimonial sensibility. Wherever there are identity prejudices in the discursive environment, there is a risk of testimonial injustice of our central sort, identity prejudicial credibility deficit. This raises the question whether we can identify a particular virtue that the hearer needs to have in order to counteract the risk of letting such prejudice distort his perceptions of speakers. We need to ask about the specifically anti-prejudicial current that the virtuous hearer's sensibility needs to contain in order that the hearer may not be led into perpetrating testimonial injustices, possibly missing out on valuable knowledge into the bargain. In order to home in on the nature of this particular virtue, let us look more closely than before at Minghell's screenplay for the talented Mr. Ripley, in which Herbert Greenleaf unjustly silences Marge Sherwood. I shall concentrate initially on the testimonial injustice he does her, in order to move on to the question of what epistemic virtue Greenleaf was lacking and what exactly Greenleaf's moral status is, given the historical context. It is the 50s and we are in Venice. Herbert Greenleaf, a rich American industrialist, is visiting, accompanied by a private detective whom he has hired to help solve the mystery of the whereabouts of his renegade son, Dickie. Dickie Greenleaf recently got engaged to his girlfriend, Marge Sherwood, but subsequently spent a great deal of time traveling with their friend Tom Ripley, until Dickie mysteriously disappeared. Marge is increasingly distrustful of Ripley because he seems to be obsessed with Dickie and suspiciously bound up with his strange disappearance. She also knows very well that it is unlike Dickie, unreliable philanderer though he undoubtedly was, simply to do a bunk, let alone to commit suicide, which is the hypothesis that Ripley is at pains to encourage. Ripley, however, has all along done a successful job of sucking up to Greenleaf Sr., so Marge is entirely alone in her suspicion, her correct suspicion, that Dickie has been murdered and that Ripley is his killer.
Herbert Greenleaf has just asked Ripley to be as helpful as he can in filling in the blanks of Dickie's life to Mac Karen, the private detective, and Ripley responds, "Ripley, I'll try my best, sir. Obviously, I'll do anything to help Dickie." Marge looks at him in contempt. "Herbert Greenleaf, this theory, the letter he left for you, the police think that's a clear indication he was planning on doing something to himself." "Marge, I just don't believe that." "Herbert Greenleaf, you don't want to, dear. I'd like to talk to Tom alone, perhaps this afternoon. Would you mind, Marge, what a man may say to his sweetheart and what he'll admit to another fellow?" Marge, such as to.
Here Marge is being gently, kindly sidelined by Greenleaf Sr., who pathologizes her conviction that Dickie would not kill himself as a sweetheart's wishful thinking. He also assumes, wrongly at least to some extent, that Marge is innocent of the more tawdry facts of Dickie's life, so that his primary attitude towards her on the one hand and the truth about Dickie on the other is that she needs protection from it. Ripley exploits and reinforces this. Later that day, when Greenleaf and Ripley are alone, Greenleaf gloomily reflects, "No, Marge doesn't know the half of it." And Ripley responds, "I think it might hurt her to know." 3. Greenleaf's everyday theory about what a man may say to his sweetheart, etc., though quite possibly true enough, has the effect of undermining Marge as a possessor of knowledge about the lover she had been living with for some time. Greenleaf is only too aware of how little he himself knows of his son, pathetically enthusiastic as he is at the prospect that the private detective might help make good this ignorance, and yet he fails to see Marge as the source of knowledge about Dickie that she manifestly is. This attitude leads Greenleaf to ignore one of Marge's key reasons for her correct hypothesis that Dickie has died at the hands of Ripley. She finds Dickie's rings at Ripley's place, one of which had been a gift from her and which he had sworn never to remove. Greenleaf ignores it, partly because he underestimates Dickie's commitment to Marge, so that in his eyes any promise to Marge on Dickie's part is virtually worthless, but mostly because Ripley successfully constructs Marge as hysterical. Indeed, not only Greenleaf but also Marge's friend, Peter Smith Kingsley, comes to perceive her that way, so that the net result is a collusion of men against Marge's word being taken seriously. The theme of knowledge ever to the fore in the dialogue, we at one point hear her off-screen shortly after she finds the rings, her powers of expression seemingly reduced to a self-contradictory mantra, repeating emphatically to the incredulous Greenleaf, I don't know, I just know it." And it is at this point that Greenleaf replies with the familiar put-down, "Marge, there's female intuition and then there are facts." A number of these sorts of exchange build up to the scene in which Marge, being taken back to America, is being ushered onto a boat but breaks away to lunge at Ripley, exclaiming, "I know it was you, I know it was you, Tom, I know it was you, I know you killed Dickie, I know it was you." Mac Karen, the private detective, comes out of the waiting boat physically to restrain her, and the stage direction reads, Ripley looks at him as if to say, "What can you do? She's hysterical." Mac Karen nods, pulls her onto the boat. Here we see poor Marge in some measure actually becoming what she has been constructed as, a hysterical female, apparently expressing herself in semi-contradictions, sticking to intuitions in the face of others' reasons, unable to keep a grip on her emotions, thus the sinister mechanism of causal construction. Perversely, we catch a whiff here of how such causal construction might seem to supply an 11th-hour justification for the original prejudiced credibility judgment. Such is the power that some prejudices have for self-fulfillment. Greenleaf's wrongful credibility judgment of Marge cannot itself be retrospectively justified, however, for when the judgment was made, the evidence did not support it. Still, it must be acknowledged that the frustrated and semi-articulate expressive form that Marge's suspicions come to take creates a terrible justificatory loop, so that given Greenleaf's point of view, there's no irrationality on his part if he views her behavior as confirming his perception of her as non-trustworthy. As the viewer is aware, however, the construction was and remains radically unfair. Marge was right. She knew Dickie well, infidelity and all, and her clear-eyed accommodation to him is in large part what led her to the permanently lonely knowledge she now possesses that Ripley has killed him, She knew she could not rely on his sexual fidelity, but she also knew that he would not have given away that ring. Marge's suspicions should have been listened to. She of all people should have been given some credibility. But Ripley cynically exploits the gender attitudes of the day so that the kindly and well-meaning men around her effectively collude with him to make her appear epistemically untrustworthy. This example, like our earlier example of the fatal testimonial injustice suffered by Tom Robinson, presents us with a case of a hearer's testimonial sensibility delivering a prejudiced perception of the speaker. Thus we are presented with a fault in judgment occurring at the spontaneous, unreflective level. The spontaneous operation of Greenleaf's testimonial sensibility is flawed, for it is trained in part by the gender prejudices of the day. Sometimes there can be a fault at the reflective level too, however, depending on how far the context places the onus on the hearer to shift intellectual gear and engage in active, self-critical reflection concerning the deliverances of his testimonial sensibility. Certainly in the formal context of a courtroom, for instance, jurors are under an obligation to reflect actively on the spontaneous deliverances of their testimonial sensibility, and they are seriously at fault if they fail to do so. One way or another, both our examples illustrate a hearer or hearers failing to correct for identity prejudice in their testimonial sensibility. In both cases, hearers fail to exercise any critical awareness regarding the prejudice that is distorting their perception of the speaker, so that the distorted spontaneous deliverance of their testimonial sensibility is left unchecked. I shall suggest below that Greenleaf's prejudiced perception of Marge is ultimately non-culpable because of the historical context. By contrast, this cannot be said for the jurors at Tom Robinson's trial, who have ample opportunity to grasp and make good the conflict between the distrust which their corrupted sensibility spontaneously delivers, and the trust which a proper attention to the evidence would inspire, a proper attention which others present, white as well as black, are clearly able to give. Even if members of the jury were to be partially forgiven for the way in which their sensibility has been hitherto saturated with the powerful racial prejudices of the day, they remain starkly culpable in failing to respond appropriately to the heightened testimonial experience afforded by the trial, given the overwhelming evidence in favor of the judgment that Tom is telling the truth. What sort of critical awareness is needed for a hearer to be able to correct for identity prejudice in a given credibility judgment? In the case of Herbert Greenleaf, he fails to correct for the way in which his habits of hearer response are saturated with the sexist constructions of gender, notably, ideas of women's innocence of the truths of men and their need to be protected from such truths, ideas of feminine intuitiveness being an obstacle to rational judgment, and even ideas of a female susceptibility to hysterics. Similarly, the jurors of Macomb County fail to correct for the way in which their habits of hearer response are saturated with racist constructions of the Negro, that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women. In both examples, the influence of a prejudicial stereotype in the hearer's testimonial sensibility marks a corrupt operation of identity power between speaker and hearer. Social imaginative ideas of Negro or woman distort the hearer's credibility judgment, and this operation of identity power controls who can convey knowledge to whom and, by the same token, who can gain knowledge from whom. Depending on which aspects of the scenario one wants to highlight, one will focus either on the agential identity power being actively exercised by Greenleaf over Marge, and by the jurors over Tom Robinson, or, alternatively, one will focus on the purely structural operation of identity power that is effectively controlling Greenleaf and Marge, jurors and Tom Robinson alike. This latter purely structural description is appropriate if one wishes to highlight the fact that all parties are to some extent under the control of a gender or racial ideology. But since my aim is to highlight the injustice that is occurring, and the sense in which the hearers are preventing the speakers from conveying knowledge, it is the agential description that types against whom there are atmospheric prejudices. Obviously, the question of how broad someone's testimonial experience is depends on the contingencies of their life and place in the social scheme. But if generally speaking, our testimonial experience is anything less than maximally broad, then the extent to which we could display the virtue fully, spontaneously rather than reflectively, will remain patchy across the span of identity prejudices. This puts partial possession in a more ideal-seeming light after all, for it reveals a general reason to expect most virtuous hearers to need to engage in active critical reflection some of the time. Perhaps some combination of spontaneity and reflectiveness may be the ideal. Perhaps we should think of the ideal hearer as someone for whom correcting for familiar prejudices has become second nature, while the requisite alertness to the influence of less familiar prejudices remains a matter of ongoing active critical reflection. This seems about right. What matters is that somehow or other one succeeds, reliably enough through time and across a suitable span of prejudices, in correcting for prejudice in one's credibility judgments. If one succeeds in that, then one has got the virtue of testimonial justice. 4.2 History, Blame, and Moral Disappointment. The picture of the virtue of testimonial justice that we now have before us is of a virtue that is bound to be hard to achieve, owing to the psychologically stealthy and historically dynamic nature of prejudice. Prejudice is a powerful visceral force, especially when it is expressed less at the level of belief than at the level of those social, imaginative, and emotional commitments that more surreptitiously shape hearers' perceptions of speakers. And even if one were faced only with correcting for prejudice at the level of belief, this too can be very hard while those beliefs are propped up by imaginative and emotional contents. It remains for the most part, however, something that we can and should aim for in practice. If we are able to achieve it only rather patchily across different sorts of prejudice, that is already a valuable achievement. There are circumstances, however, under which the virtue cannot be achieved, for it is an ethically significant feature of this virtue that it displays a special sort of cultural historical contingency. In order to explain this, let me follow Linda Zagzebski's reading of Aristotle such that virtues are defined as having both a motivational component and a component of reliable success in bringing about the end of that motivation. In the case of intellectual virtues, there will always be a motivation to achieve truth in one or another guise, but usually there will also be a more proximal aim to achieve something that is conducive to truth, notably here, the aim of neutralizing the impact of prejudice in one's credibility judgments. As a matter of definition, then, our virtuous hearer will be reliably successful in fulfilling that proximal aim of neutralizing prejudice. She will succeed in this insofar as her judgments are inflected with a certain reflexive critical awareness of the prejudicial distortions mediating between herself as hearer and her particular interlocutor, and insofar as she is able to correct for that distortion. As is always the case, some people will be better motivated and better able to achieve these things than others. But in the case of testimonial justice, it is not only personal differences that explain the fact that some will and some won't possess the virtue. It is also a matter of the cultural historical setting. A setting in which there is little critical awareness of the construction of gender, say, is a setting in which people are not generally in a position to possess the virtue of testimonial justice vis-à-vis identity prejudice against women. There is a sense in which just about any virtue may be thought of as historically contingent. One can always imagine a society in which nobody exhibited a given ethical or intellectual virtue, charity or open-mindedness, say, and consider that it would be well-nigh impossible for anyone to cultivate the virtue in soil so barren of good example. But the special respect in which the achievement of testimonial justice depends on the historical setting is over and above this general dependence, for it concerns the specific critical reflective tools that are required to achieve the virtue. Even in a society in which the virtue of testimonial justice was possessed in respect of some prejudices, there might be other prejudices in respect of which the virtue was out of reach, except to those, that is, who possess it naively. But I have already said that the naive form of the virtue must be very much the exception. This would seem to mark out the virtue as unusual, though the ethical virtue of justice presumably exhibits the same historical dependence for the same reasons. There might be judgments of justice that cannot be made because they require a line of reflection for which the concepts are not socio-historically available. If there are other virtues of justice, other virtues with justice as their ultimate end, then perhaps their achievement would exhibit the same historical contingency. At any rate, on the face of it, this particular form of historical contingency seems to be special to matters of justice. In the case of Herbert Greenleaf, we see this historical contingency played out in respect of the absence of a critical awareness of gender prejudice in the society in which his ethical and epistemic second nature were formed. While the Herbert Greenleafs of this world were always at fault in failing to exhibit the virtue, I suggest they were not culpably at fault until the requisite critical consciousness of gender became available to them. As we might put it, they were not culpably at fault until they were in a position to know better. There is no precise answer to the question at what point a Herbert Greenleaf comes to be in a position where he should know better than to neglect the possibility that Marge is right. And this question is surely best construed as a matter of degree, not least because the requisite collective gender consciousness is something that is likely to dawn only gradually. But no doubt a figure such as Herbert Greenleaf would be in that position long before he actually lived up to it by taking on board the gender-critical insights made newly available to him. Thus there will tend to be some period of historical transition in which a Herbert Greenleaf, well-intentioned as he may remain, moves from non-culpable fault to culpable fault. He lacks the virtue of testimonial justice with regard to gender prejudice throughout, but the relevant advance in collective consciousness is needed to render the shortcoming in his epistemic conduct blameworthy. Under the historical circumstances, then, my suggestion is that Greenleaf is not blameworthy for the testimonial injustice he inflicts on Marge. Given that blame is out of order, the epistemic wrong that Greenleaf does Marge presents a genuine case of non-culpable testimonial injustice. The suggestion rests on the idea that one cannot be blamed for failing to do something if one was not in a position to access the reason to do it. This presents a special case affat implisken, since in our example second part is a matter of whether Greenleaf could reasonably be expected to achieve the critical perspective on gender that would have enabled him to question his lack of trust in Marge in the requisite way. We do not blame people for things they objectively cannot do or cannot help doing, though that is not to say that their life will not be ethically tarnished. In an extreme case, someone might be torn apart by what they have done, even if they wholly accepted they were not blameworthy for it. 14. Greenleaf could not neutralize the impact of gender prejudice in his judgment of Marge because the critical concepts he needed were not historically available to him. This points to an interesting kind of epistemic and moral bad luck. On an external interpretation of what it is to have a reason, the situation is fairly straightforward. Greenleaf has a reason to doubt his spontaneous distrust of Marge's word, but his historical situation is such that he cannot access that reason. He is thereby subject to a piece of epistemic and moral bad luck. On an internal interpretation of reasons, the situation is slightly less straightforward. While Greenleaf has a subjective motivation to know the truth about his son's disappearance, and not to be taken in by his ingratiating killer, Thesson deliberative route, he would need to take from there in order to arrive at the motivation to doubt his distrust of Marge is blocked by his historical circumstances. On the internal reason's conception, then, Greenleaf is unable to possess a reason to doubt his distrust of Marge. Even while, objectively speaking, there is a deliberative route running between the reason and actual motivations in Greenleaf's subjective motivational set, the fact that Greenleaf's historical situation prevents him from treading that deliberative route means that it cannot be a reason for him. This adds another dimension to Greenleaf's epistemic and moral bad luck, as it renders it bad luck not merely about what reasons he can access, which affects what he does, but moreover about what reasons he can have, which affects who he is. Whatever one thinks about the disagreements between internal and external reasons theorists, if one is inclined towards the internal idiom to describe cases of testimonial injustice such as that which Greenleaf perpetrates, it is worth noting that it could not be controversial in anything like the way that purely ethical cases inevitably are. This is because it could not be controversial to assume that epistemic subjects considered as such possess in their actual set of motivations some general motivation to truth, and a fortiori some motivation to more proximal ends which are in the service of truth, such as neutralizing prejudice in one's habits of trust, for instance. That is why it makes little difference whether one prefers to construe our present example according to the internal reasons model or the external reasons model, for all may agree that, in general, any epistemic subject will have a reason to get at the truth. This is not to underestimate the complex and often troubled nature of our relationship with truth. Human beings are obviously subject to all sorts of powerful motivations, and indeed reasons, for shielding themselves from painful truths through mechanisms of denial or repression. On the whole, however, one must see such mechanisms against a background of a more general motivation to truth. Given this, it is clear that not just Herbert Greenleaf, but even the most virulent, dyed-in-the-wool sexist version of Herbert Greenleaf, possesses a motivation to truth from which there is a sound, deliberative route to questioning his spontaneous lack of trust in Marge. On this as yet rather charitable interpretation of Greenleaf's moral status, then he is unlucky both epistemically and morally. More precisely, he is subject to two kinds of moral and epistemic bad luck: circumstantial bad luck in the socio-historical context that puts the requisite reflexive critical awareness out of his reach, and constitutive bad luck in the kind of person he is. More precisely, his case exemplifies a compound of circumstantial and constitutive bad luck, for it is specifically historical circumstance that has constituted him as someone who is unable to have a reason to doubt his lack of trust in Marge. Let us say, then, that Greenleaf is subject to a historical constitutive form of bad epistemic and moral luck. The significance of this sort of luck is that its constitutive power is not at the level of the agent's personality, the kind of person one happens to be as an individual, but rather at the level of historical type, so that it is one's place in history that constrains what thoughts are available to one, and thus what reasons one can have. The upshot for Greenleaf is that he misses out on a truth that he is especially interested in acquiring. Marge is right. Ripley is Dickie's murderer, and he is guilty of doing something very bad to someone he cares about. Marge is treated as a hysterical female who cannot handle the truth, someone who deserves protection and sympathy but not epistemic trust. If one's rationality is an essential part of one's humanity, then Greenleaf gently undermines Marge in her very humanity. But now we need to qualify our exculpation of Greenleaf, for surely he is not altogether off the hook. If history puts blame out of court, is there some other form of moral resentment that remains in play? The line between what we should and should not blame people for, what we may and may not properly expect of them and of ourselves, is surely fuzzy, and especially so across historical distance. Given what Greenleaf does to Marge, and given the moral conceptual resources that he did have available, which surely included ideas about the wrongs of condescension, respect for the sort of hard evidence that she in fact produces, some general ideas about prejudice being unfair, and so on, we might well feel some sort of qualified moral resentment towards him. It is disappointing, after all, that he colludes with the gender ideology of the day quite so readily, and ignores with such ease Marge's attempts to bring her evidence to his attention. At the very least, he might have held out longer, listened to her more, been more circumspect with regard to Ripley's dismissive comments about her being hysterical. In short, we want to complain that he could have done better, where this registers not just an epistemic disappointment but also an ethical one. We may well feel, then, a certain resentment of disappointment, an attitude which is closely related to the resentment of blame but falls short of it. The resentment of disappointment is still focused on the individual, but the individual conceived in a historically situated manner. Can we say more to vindicate the resentment of disappointment across historical distance? We need to resist thinking of a culture's moral discourse, moral system, as it is sometimes called, as a finite monolith. The resources for moral judgment and moral thought offered up by any moral discourse are not like a set of building bricks with which one can build a finite number of different structures. Conceptual resources are resources for generating indefinitely many new meanings, whether as new applications of old concepts or coinings of new concepts. Such resources for meaning are generative and dynamic, never exhausted by the set of meanings actually realized in practical use at any given historical moment. With this generative conception of moral meaning in place, we are able to introduce a distinction between routine discursive moves in a moral discourse and exceptional, more imaginative moves in which existing resources are used in an innovative way that stands as a progressive move in moral consciousness. An example of such an imaginative move might be the extension of a notion of respect to all humanity as made by someone ethically formed in a society that routinely reserved respect for the ruling classes, or the new application of the concept, cruel, to violent punishments of children routinely meted out in the name of ordinary discipline. Most of us most of the time make routine moves and exhibit routine moral thinking, and we are lucky if we live in a culture where this means that our ethical thinking is on the whole decent. But sometimes people can rise to a challenge and succeed in something more imaginative. Here, once again, we can draw a helpful parallel in the epistemic dimension. The relevant epistemic contrast is between routine credibility judgments and exceptional credibility judgments, where the relevant sort of exceptional judgment might be a judgment that succeeds in correcting for a sort of prejudice not hitherto understood as such. If we judge Greenleaf in the light of the full ethical resources of his day, then while we may find that the epistemic injustice he does Marge is not culpable, he judged routinely, we may still see it as less than it might have been less than exceptional. For even Greenleaf might have risen to the occasion and done something morally and epistemically more imaginative than get drawn into Ripley's conspiratorial story about Marge's female hysteria. There is admittedly nothing very much about Greenleaf to inspire high hopes in this regard, but still, he is a decent man who has known Marge for longer than he has known Ripley, and who has a strong personal interest in knowing the truth. So one might well feel some pang of moral resentment over the ease with which he is drawn into the epistemically insulting construal of her suspicions. Any such disappointment is grounded in the conviction that it was historically possible, in our newly extended sense, for him to have made a better credibility judgment. Even Greenleaf could have judged exceptionally. By judging merely routinely in these heightened circumstances, he does something disappointing that it seems appropriate to hold him responsible for in some way. But the sense in which his moral and epistemic character is besmirched by his failure to rise above the routine is not enough to warrant anything as strong as blame. One cannot be blamed for making a routine moral judgment. But one can nonetheless be held responsible for making a merely routine judgment in a context in which a more exceptional alternative is, as a matter of historical possibility, just around the corner, and I have suggested that it is appropriate to register this responsibility by way of the resentment of disappointment. The distinction between exceptional and routine moral judgment, then, points to the possibility of a more nuanced range of moral attitudes to historically and culturally distant others, regardless of whether one holds to the internal or the external interpretation of reasons, for it allows us to avoid the hubris of deeming them blameworthy for actions not routinely regarded as wrong in their culture, while still holding them morally responsible to this or that extent, depending on how nearly available the exceptional moral move is judged to have been. If this is right, then the distinction between exceptional and routine moral discursive moves can help us better understand the issues at stake in the topic of moral relativism. When we judge the behavior of people in historically or socially distant moral cultures, we need not and should not confine ourselves to the routine moral discourse of that culture, except in so far as we are only interested in issues of blame, since more appropriately nuanced judgments of the moral performance of people in distant cultures will become available only when we also consider what non-routine, more exceptionally imaginative moral judgments might have been made had they better exploited their own moral resources. In the meta-ethical literature, we find a fundamental tension rehearsed and re-rehearsed in different ways, and from different sides of the debate, between the universalist pull of moral psychology and language and the apparent fact of cultural and historical contingency. Time and again, we come up against the seeming dead end that we can imagine another culture in which there are morally accepted practices that we find unacceptable. And yet, while we are reticent, even unable, to adopt a policy of withholding judgment, we simultaneously sense an eerie lack of justification for blaming these distant others for their actions. But the distinction between the routine and the exceptional helps us see that there need be no dead end for moral thinking here, for it opens up a space for the resentment of disappointment, an attitude still directed to the individual agent, but one which acknowledges his or her historical predicament. The vulgar relativist idea that it is wrong to pass moral judgments on people in other moral cultures is incoherent, but the related idea that judgments of blame may be out of order across even quite small historical distances ought to be defended. Judgments of blame are out of order when people's behavior is the product of ethical thinking that was routine in their ethical culture. When, for example, we consider the past practice of forcing unmarried mothers to put their babies up for adoption, we should not confine ourselves to the concepts, attitudes, and feelings we surmise were routinely invoked in the daily moral discourse of that society at that time. Rather, we are entitled to appeal to thoughts which they could have had, given their full ethical resources, but failed to. And we may contrast their deliberative performance with that of their peers, who succeeded in making the exceptionally imaginative moves that gradually gained critical mass so as to propel the community towards a more liberal practice, factoring in, of course, the moral cognitive advantage had by those most directly involved with the practice itself, those who witnessed or felt for themselves the pain of the mother's separation, the effects on the child, and so on. The distinction between routine and exceptional moral judgment helps to explain how a piece of moral progress, the move away from a practice of forced adoption, for instance, is possible. For how else but through the morally exceptional discursive moves of the few is a community able to come to see things differently as a matter of routine? To judge historical others in this way is not hubris, for we can acknowledge that could do better will be our own ethical epitaph too. It is a matter of luck how far living up to what is morally routine is an achievement that leaves one immune from the resentment of disappointment on the part of distant others. It depends significantly on the contingencies that have formed one, and on those that will form future generations. I am often conscious, for instance, of the fact that while I eat meat in semi-good conscience, a vegetarian future society would judge people like me with moral abhorrence. I believe that members of such a society would probably be entitled to real moral disappointment in, say, my failure to follow through on my extant moral commitment to animals kept as pets. Why, they would ask, did I not recognize my implicit commitment to equal moral status among animals more generally? I ask myself such questions but never quite answer them. But if future generations do come to regard eating animals as obviously morally wrong in this way, perhaps none the less they might withhold blame from people like me, on the grounds that what they regard as my moral failing is sufficiently within the bounds of contemporary routine moral judgment. I think that identifying forms of moral resentment that fall short of blame but which are still agent-directed is the key to achieving appropriate moral response across historical and cultural distance. More generally, distinguishing routine from exceptional moral judgments helps us honor the universalist trajectory of moral psychology and language, but without doing violence to historical contingency. In this chapter, I have characterized the virtue for which the phenomenon of testimonial injustice creates the need, the virtue of testimonial justice, and I have explored the historical contingency of its possession conditions. The picture we have arrived at is of a virtue which may, at a given point in history, be unavailable in respect of some prejudices. Having characterized the virtue in this historically situated manner, however, Let us now place it in a maximally ahistorical setting, the setting of the state of nature. Doing so will reveal how far the virtue of testimonial justice is a fundamental epistemic virtue, that is, an epistemic virtue serving a purpose which transcends history in that it arises out of an epistemic need that is present in any human society. You have reached the end of the document.